Alliance. I want to invite you, I want to welcome you to another in our series of webinars. Um, as a communications provider, you have a duty to protect the customer proprietary network information, or the CPNI. And if you violate that duty, it could cost you multi-millions of dollars. You have an obligation to report data breaches to the federal government and to the state government. And you have additional obligations if the breach involves health and financial information. And that's what today's all about. Data breaches, how to report, and how to respond to them. I'm pleased to introduce our subject matter experts for today. First, we have our own Mike Pryor from Brownstein Law. Mike, as you all probably know, is a regulatory attorney, has extensive knowledge on communications law, policy, and the administrative processes. And we have Jack Hoba, also from Brownstein Law, who specializes in cybersecurity law, consulting, privacy law, and technology transactions. Michael, Jack, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to kind of disappear, and you guys take it away, please.
Well, great. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you who are joining us today. So Jack and I are going to kind of tag team through some information, but before we even begin, let me just start with the traditional disclaimer that despite the fact that we're both lawyers, we are not dispensing legal advice today. We're just trying to get you up to date on what's going on. So if you have questions, reach out to us or reach out to your counsel. So with that, let's get started and talk about the topics for today. So we're going to, at a high level, talk about what the cybersecurity threat landscape looks like. Then we'll spend some time talking about the FCC's new data breach reporting rules. And then Jack will talk you through more from a business perspective, you know, how to identify an incident and how to respond. So let's start with diving in and Jack talking about the threat landscape.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So here's a book that you can actually go out to Amazon and buy, Black Hat Python. Black hats are the bad guys. And I'm a Python programmer, so this is on my book list. But you can see where you don't have to be brilliant anymore to figure out how to be a hacker. You can also get software as a service for ransomware. Next slide, please.
So telecom companies in particular are targets for hackers and as Jack said, the bad guys. I'm not going to read through these headlines, but as you can see, it's not at all rare for telecom companies who store a lot of data to be lucrative targets for the bad guys, and so you need to really be on top of this and make sure that your systems are locked in tight, and God forbid, should an incident occur, know how to deal with it. So Jack, going back to you to talk about on the next slide, you know, there are lots of reporting requirements out there.
Yes, and they keep growing. We're going to focus on the new FCC reporting requirements today, but there's a lot of other sectors that require reporting, depending on the type of data you handle. You could, if you have HIPAA data, there's a set of reporting requirements through the FTC, financial data through the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, FERPA, which is the education data. Oddly enough, they don't have a reporting requirement. It's a really old law. All 50 states have data breach notification laws. All 50 states, 3 territories, and the District of Columbia. And normally it's the high threshold for reporting or for triggering reporting, such as Social Security number, driver's license, ID, financial information. Basically, it's anything that could cause identity theft. And then you have your contractual obligations, which are your agreements with your vendors and perhaps your customers, and that reporting is going to depend on the language of the contract itself.
I think we need to move ahead.
Yeah, I think we went backwards.
Yeah, next slide, please. So we're going to focus on the FCC for a bit. And one reason to focus on the FCC is the agency is not shy about imposing stiff fines if they find that companies have not taken reasonable care to protect the kind of data that they have and that they store. This is just an example of a few of the forfeiture orders that have come out over the last couple of years. And it's all kinds of mistakes or just sometimes just sloppiness a little bit. For example, QLink had lots of information out and was allowing people to sign on their websites using just, run-of-the-mill available biographical information, which is a violation of the FCC's rules. AT&T had the unfortunate experience of having some of its workers in a center in Mexico steal some data, and then they end up being responsible for it. And a few years ago, Terracom settled a case where they were putting lifeline information on servers without any protection. So the FCC, it doesn't necessarily have to be a lack of reporting that gets you in trouble with the FCC. Again, it's not taking steps to protect. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the FCC in December released some new data breach reporting rules. The FCC's had some reporting rules on the books since 2007, and this is the first time they've been significantly updated, with a caveat that the FCC tried to do this a few years ago, but was essentially overturned by Congress. But let's go to the next slide and see what's going on with these new rules. First thing is they expanded the definition of what a breach is to include an inadvertent disclosure. The next thing they did is they expanded the type of data that's covered. It now not only is CP&I, but also personally identifiable information that is subject to the reporting rules. And the FCC added itself to one of the agencies to which telecom companies have to report a breach, in addition to the FBI and the Secret Service, which is the current reporting requirement. They also revised some of the deadlines and triggers for when to report, and adopted harm-based triggers for when you have to report to your customer. And then they added some record retention requirements. So let's kind of dig into each of these a little bit, and we'll give you an idea of what the FCC did. As I mentioned, the first thing they did is they expanded the definition of breach. It's now any instance in which a person without authorization or exceeding authorization has gained access to, used, or disclosed data. And again, what's missing is that there's no longer a requirement that there has to be an intent here. It can just be negligence or a mistake. There is, however, in light of this expansion, a sort of a good faith exception if an employee or a contractor sort of in good faith accidentally gets access to information that that person is not authorized to have access to, as long as that information is not disclosed or used improperly, then there's no notification required. Next slide, please. So what kind of information now is subject to the reporting requirements? Well, in addition to customer proprietary network information, which has always been and continues to be covered, now there's, as I said, PII, and there's some definitions in the order, the FCC's order, about what PII is, and it kind of tracks, I think, what a lot of the state laws and other laws have, but it includes things like a person's name, as long as it's in combination, for example, with a government-issued identification number, like a driver's license or social security number or passport, or information that, for example, could be used to gain access to an account, like an account number. Also includes username and email addresses if it's in combination with passwords or security answers or questions and answers. And again, in combination with other information, like a PIN number, so that you can take now, you have the name, plus you have all this other information that you can then use to do some identity impersonation or theft and commit fraud. There's also unique biometric, generic, and medical data. And finally, there's a concept called disassociated data, which is like like a birth date or something. If that disassociated data is then able to be combined or linked to other information, so that you can now link that birth date to a name or some other information, that's also PII. So it expands pretty greatly the amount of information that is covered. And I will say, I know that a lot of your companies don't necessarily directly serve end user customers and consumers. You provide services to businesses, so you might not have as much PII as an entity that directly serves end users, but you likely will still have CP&I, and so these new reporting rules are still important for you. So next slide, please. So there are really kind of two major types of reporting. There's reporting to the federal government, and specifically the FBI, the Secret Service, and now the FCC. And then there's reporting to your customers or consumers whose data has been breached. So initially, I'm going to focus on what the rules are to report to the federal agencies. And the FCC has set up some triggers about when you have to engage in this kind of reporting. One trigger is simply numerical. If 500 or more customers' data has been breached, you have to report. Whether there's concern about harm or not, it's strictly a numerical number. You also have to report if you can't really determine how many customers may have been affected. By default, you have to report. You have to report smaller breaches, but only if there's a reasonable likelihood of harm. So those are the sort of the high-level triggers for what's called per breach notification, which means that if one of these triggers is met, then you have to report that, and as soon as practicable, but no later than 7 business days after a reasonable determination that there's been a breach. So a reasonable determination means it's sort of more likely than not that there's been some kind of unauthorized access. I think Jack later will talk a little bit more about how to assess whether there's been a reportable incident. You're not completely off the hook if you have one of these smaller breaches that you've decided reasonably doesn't cause harm. You still have to engage in an annual reporting process. And so on February 1st of each year, you have to report whether you've had any of these smaller non-harmful incidents. Next slide, thank you. So how do you report? Well, there's an FCC portal that is up already that's used for reporting to the FBI or the Secret Service, and they'll make adjustments as necessary so that will also the report will also then go to the Federal Communications Commission. So what do you have to include in one of these notifications? There's a list that the FCC sort of provides. It's your address and contact information, a description of the breach or incident, how was the data accessed, what was the method of compromise, sort of what was the date range in which people had unauthorized access, the approximate number of customers affected, and whether there's any sort of estimate of financial loss to providers or the customers, and the type of data access. These are sort of required pieces of information. If you ever have to look at this form, you'll see there's some optional fields that you can also fill in. You're not required to. Includes things like the customer's billing addresses. So let's go to the next slide, and now we'll turn to what you have to do to report a breach to one of your customers. And here the FCC has adopted a harm-based trigger. you have to notify customers if it's reasonably likely that they've been harmed. And there's no numerical threshold to this. If one customer or two customers are harmed by this, you have to give notice to your customers. And again, the only time you kind of don't have to do this is if you can reasonably determine that it's likely that there wasn't any harm. So this is it's something you'll have to carefully review in terms of what's been released. Now, the timing of when you have to do one of these reports, you have to do this without unreasonable delay after you've notified the federal agencies. So once that 7-day period for notification to the FCC or the Social Security Secret Service has passed, then as soon as practicable after that date, you have to notify customers. Unless one of those agencies reaches out to you and says, hold on, don't report anything yet. We're doing some investigation, hold off. But depending on what the agencies tell you, you have an outside date of 30 days after reasonable determination that there's been a breach to notify your customers. There used to be in the FCC's rules the sort of 7-day mandatory waiting period. But that's been eliminated now. So again, it's without unreasonable delay, and the FCC will look at things like, the size of the telecom company, how many resources do you have to do investigations and so forth. But the kind of a general expectations that it may take smaller companies a little longer to do this than bigger companies. There is a what's called a notification safe harbor. If what has been accessed is encrypted and you have definitive proof that the encryption key was not compromised, then technically there's been no breach and there's no reporting obligation. So next slide, please. So what is harm? So the FCC has kind of listed a pretty long list of things that constitute harm to a customer. It's not just financial harm, but it could be physical harm, identity theft, theft of services, potential for blackmail, disclosure of private facts, reputational harm, emotional harm, embarrassment. Some of a longer list than you might find in some of the state disclosure reporting laws. So it'd be interesting to see. I mean, there's not a kind of private right of action based on these kinds of harms, but it'd be interesting to see, if plaintiffs' firms decide to kind of rely on this longer list. We're going to talk later about not just the types of harm, but how to kind of factors determine whether that harm is likely. Things like how sensitive was the data. And we'll talk a little bit about what the notice to the customer should say. The FCC doesn't specify, but the notice has to have sort of sufficient information to make a reasonable customer aware that a breach has occurred, sort of an estimated time frame when that happened, and whether the customer's data was affected. And then apart from that fundamental standard, the FCC has some further recommendations, again, that we'll go into a little bit later. Things like, you should, again, the estimated date of the breach and so forth. And the FCC doesn't specify, how you have to make that notice to your customer. You probably use whatever means you typically use to communicate with your customer. So that's so that's kind of the rundown of, at a high level, the two different kinds of new reporting requirements that the FCC has adopted. Next slide, please. So there's also, along with this, a record retention requirement. You have to retain any records that you created regarding a breach or an incident. And you have to keep that for 2 years. And you can see the kinds of information records that the FCC would expect you to keep. Notifications that you send around, again, dates, circumstances, how you determine the number of customers affected and so forth. But, again, as Jack probably will talk about, you really should be documenting all of this very carefully anyway. Next slide, please. So the effective date of these rules is kind of tricky. The rule itself is effective March 13th. But the reporting obligations don't really go into effect until the Office of Management and Budget has approved them. They haven't done that yet. We'll be informed by the FCC when that happens. So parts of the order are in effect, but the reporting obligations aren't. So that gets a little tricky. And again, if you find yourself having questions about this, reach out to us and we'll try to parse through it, or reach out to your counsel. I will say, this is a controversial order. I think it's going to be appealed. There's a lot going on now about, what kind of deference the court has to give to an agency when it reviews what the agency has done, and this appeal could get affected by that. So there's a lot of interesting legal jockeying, I think, that'll go on in the future. I think with that, then I'm going to stop and let Jack get going on what to do here more specifically. Jack.
And of course, I had muted myself, so you didn't hear a word I said. We're going to hop into what exactly is a breach. That can be a fuzzy word. But first, we need to understand what is an incident, and we're going to talk about that. Next slide, please. So what's an incident? We have events in our networks that are happening all the time. If I log into my account here at Brownstein, that is going to be logged. If I use my fob to enter the building, that's going to be logged. If your browser connects to a server, when you're searching for something, that gets logged. So those are all events, and those events are normally collected if they're considered important in a log file. So for an example here is that if you mistype your password, likely that's going to be logged as a rejection. And then the goal is to collect all these events centrally in a system and then mine for incidents. And an incident basically is anything that would go against your cybersecurity governance or policies. And here's an example. So if you have someone logging in with the same credentials in San Diego and Denver at the same time, that's obviously an incident because that's impossible. So that's an indication of the compromise. And not all incidents are equal. There are some that will rise to a higher need for investigation, and there are some that you'll be able to handle right away. For example, a personal device. Some companies will say you're not allowed to log onto the network with a personal device, only laptops provided by the company. That would be an event. If someone did that, that would also be an incident, and then that would be handled. And I'll add too that normally if that happens, you can expect the person who did that to have just completed company training the week before and signed off on it. So obviously that training didn't stick. Next slide, please. So let's say an incident occurred. Now what? Next slide, please. This is a day one. If you have an incident, you're going to ramp up your incident response team. Those members should already be known in advance, and incidents can get reported outside of your logging too. Perhaps a customer calls in and says, "I'm seeing this behavior in your system." That would also could be an incident. Normally within an incident response team, you'll have an incident commander that takes charge and starts bringing in the right people for the incident. You want the engineers to be available for the systems or the products that have been identified at risk with the incident. You want to start digging into what data elements are at risk. And this is a good place to bring in your legal counsel so they can start looking at your contractual reporting obligations for your customers, start looking at all the laws to determine what notification will be needed, because the clock will start ticking soon for reporting. And as Michael said, for the FCC, the reporting obligation is fairly short. You also want to bring in your customer support representatives, because customers may be noticing some things that are not operating correctly, and start getting them ramped up to deal with any questions that come in. At this time, there's really no external reporting. This is kind of hair on fire time, where you're just trying to get your brain wrapped around what's happening. And it doesn't do any good to do reporting at this time because you don't have enough knowledge. Next slide, please. So these are the stages we're going to walk through for the methodology that I use for incident response. Is called PICRL. There's a couple others out there, but PICRL stands for preparation. That's preparing for an incident. Identification, that's the identification of the incident. Containment, which is huge. Once you identify the incident, you want to contain it. And then eradication is your next step, which is root cause analysis, and then full recovery. And then at the very end, you want to have a lessons learned session where you feed everything back into preparation. So you just look at this as a big circle that's going to continually repeat itself. And as I mentioned, containment, we want to stop the bleeding. So identification and containment, containment stops the immediate threat and keeps it from spreading. It could be as easy as blocking something at a firewall. And at this point, do we know if we have a reportable FCC breach? I'll give you the attorney answer. It depends. There are certain incidents that are so severe that you'll know right away it's reportable. For example, if there's a ransomware with exfiltration of your data, that's obviously reportable. If there's something less than that, we have to do the analysis to see if we're going to report. And then the next bullet is non-FCC breach reporting that may occur. For example, I mentioned in the last slide that some of your customers may be noticing that maybe you turned off a report because there was a bug in report or a vulnerability. So you're going to be getting questions from customers that you have to respond to. So that's the kind of different reporting where you may have your help desk being hit by a lot of calls and you want to have some answers for them. And, you don't have to give away everything that's happening behind the scenes, but that you're working the issue, that you'll keep your customers posted, things that will give your customers a sense of security as you're working behind the scenes. You want this notice, anything that goes out, you want it to be reviewed. If you have a public relations department, you want it to be reviewed by them, and you want it to be reviewed by legal. It's always nice to have PR involved because they can soften the notifications. Maybe legal will write it in a more persuasive manner. And of course, you want your engineers and your customer support to verify what's going out for accuracy. And your customer support people will be very, very helpful and just handling that relationship with the customer as you're working in the background on these issues. So let's say now at this point we've got it contained, we've stopped the bleeding. So next we're going to go into the eradication phase, which is the next slide, and that's basically what we call root cause analysis, getting down into the details of what happened, why it happened, and all the details that go with that. So there's a lot here on this slide. I'll try not to read it to you verbatim, but there's a lot of pressure at this point, especially if you've turned something off. Customers are not happy, right? You may not have everything you need to do the detailed root cause analysis. So you're asking for more information from your engineering team. And once you think you have a good root cause analysis, then you need to prepare a software patch that you can get out to your customers or to your development team to fix whatever they need to fix. And maybe you got lucky. Maybe you have an upgrade that you've been working on for the system that takes care of this vulnerability. Then you'll just want to push that out to your customers. And of course, that has to be handled in a very good manner that you have your customers on board with upgrading. That's not always an easy situation. Sometimes it's not a patch or a new upgrade. Sometimes there's a configuration of the system that can be modified, and then just train your customers on that. That can be a quick solution. So throughout the containment and the root cause analysis, you want your counsel involved, because again, they're collecting information to determine what reporting will be required, if any. Not all incidents will require reporting. Maybe it will only require reporting to your customers who have been affected, and there's no legal basis in law to report. This would just be contractual reporting. The next bullet point is important because engineers, let me just step back a second. Everyone has heard the term personal information. So sometimes I find that engineers will think they understand what personal information is. And because they're not lawyers, it's always still good to check with counsel. And I've come on to a lot of incidents where an engineer has told me, don't worry, it's not PII. And when I started digging into it, there were some issues, because the definition of PII in one state was a little bit broader than another state. And that's the last practice point. Again, I was an engineer for 18 years before I went into becoming a lawyer. So yeah, engineers are fantastic, but rely on your counsel for what constitutes PII reporting requirements. Next slide, please. So let's hop into whether this is reportable under the FCC. And I think, Michael, you're going to take this slide.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So, Jack has kind of gone through, the kind of response process, and you've gotten some handle on what's happened. And again, the question is, has there been a reportable incident? And has sort of some deadline been triggered now? In other words, have you made a reasonable determination that there's been unauthorized disclosure or access? And you have some sense of its scale and scope and so forth. So now you do have reporting obligations. And again, at the FCC, you have 7 business days from the time you make a reasonable determination that there's been a breach. And, reminder that there are certain triggers that go around that. Again, if it's more than 500 or more, you have to report. If you don't know how many customers, you have to report. If it's less than 500, but you have a reasonable belief that there's going to be harm to customers, you should report that. And again, that's 7 business days from the date that you've made that reasonable determination. And then again, that's the federal reporting. And once that federal reporting has been done, now you may have an obligation to report to customers, and you have an outside date of 30 days. So you have 7 days to report to the FCC, then you have a total of 30 days to report to your customers if there's been harm. And we went through, with the different kinds of harm. And now you go, well, okay, how do I really determine whether the data that's been accessed is harmful? And again, the FCC has some factors to look at. And one, again, is how sensitive was the information? Obviously, a bank account, a social security number, something like that, financial information, very sensitive. You need to report that. Is the data something you could reuse? Do people, have passwords been accessed? Is the data something that can't really be changed, like a social security number? So, the more sensitive the data is that's been breached, the more likely it is that harm is going to occur. Next slide, please. And again, so you have to, in terms of your notification, we've talked about sensitivity. Another factor is, well, how long have people been in in your database, and what all did they get? If people, if you find someone's been in your data for days and months, that's more likely to create a problem. What steps has the company taken to try to mitigate? How quickly did you find out about the breach, and how quickly were you able to contain it? And another factor is, was the breach sort of an accidental access, or is it turned out someone intentionally was seeking to get access, through things like pretexting or device theft or something like that? Obviously, intentionality is a real red flag, because someone wants to gain access for a specific purpose. So there are a couple of bullet points I'm going to turn back over to Jack to talk about at the bottom of this slide. Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I just pulled out this illogical statement out of the rule that I kind of took issue with it. Accidentally losing a device with cover data stored on it is less likely to result in harm. And it just makes me think back to the laptop. There was a case where a laptop containing hospital information was left on a bus seat. So I just thought that statement was actually it's what we call dicta. That's not really part of the rule, but there's a lot of stuff in the rule that they put out that are basically their comments, and I kind of disagreed with this one. I think if you lose a device that has covered data, it's an issue. That's definitely an incident. Practice pointer here. I've seen. I review a lot of litigation that's pre the FCC order, but there's litigation out there now where companies are taking to task other vendors who they think didn't encrypt their data. And I just wanted to point out here that you can have encryption at the file level, and there's a key then that unlocks that encryption. So if a user logs in to that data with their account, part of logging in unencrypts the data to that user. So if you have a phishing attack, and the phisher takes over the account, they have access to unencrypted data. It doesn't mean that the company didn't encrypt the data. It just means that it was unencrypted at that moment. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and again, back to the FCC order in terms of the content of a customer notification. The FCC did lay out some recommendations that, as applicable, should go into the notice. I'm not going to read all of these to you. You can see that the kinds of things that you would normally think should be included, but they also include things like, how do I contact? How does the customer contact, and who do they contact at the company? How do they contact the FCC or the FBI? And if you think there's been a possibility of identity theft, informing the customer how to protect themselves through credit reporting agencies and monitoring agencies and so forth. So that's, again, there's a slate of recommendations, but I think a lot of these tend to be kind of commonsensical. But they're not. Again, there's some inconsistencies with what the kind of FCC thinks and maybe what some of the states think about this, Jack.
Right, and that's what the bold and the underlining above in the second bullet. When you compare that with what Massachusetts and even Maryland wants, Maryland and Massachusetts conflict on how much information you should put in your notice. And then it would appear that Massachusetts notice requirements would also conflict with the FCC. So you really have to have counsel review the notice that's going out. And keep in mind, you may be sending this notice out to thousands of customers. So you want to get it right and not cause yourself any legal problems with a state like Massachusetts. Back to you, Michael.
Yeah, I think we can probably go to the next slide at this point. And I think actually, we're not done from the business point of view in terms of what to do. Once you've gone past the reporting stage, there's still more work to be done, Jack.
Right. So we pick up here after the eradication phase, which was the root cause analysis. Now we're in recovery, where we're getting everything back to the way it was before all this happened. And you've notified, the fix has been implemented. Hopefully you're running a new software or a new configuration that handles the vulnerability or the incident that occurred. Customer support at this point will continue to handle customer relations and questions. There's always questions that go on for a period after the incident. And there's I'm sure you can all relate, there's always that customer that needs a little extra hand holding. And especially if you've had a customer that's been hit by a couple other incidents, maybe not even from your company, they may be overly sensitive to what just happened. And I've often, when I was in-house, gotten with our CISO and hopped on a call with those large customers and maybe disgruntled. Transparency is the best here. And then public relations, there may be some social media fallout or news fallout that they will have to deal with. And again, you want legal involved with that to make sure you're not putting out anything that's going to get you in legal trouble. And the last phase, as we mentioned with Pickerel, is the lessons learned. This is where you fold everything back into your preparation phase to get ready for the next one from the lessons that you learned in this incident. Next slide, please. So, when you report, as you notice, there's a lot of reporting that could potentially happen here. The FBI, the FCC. Well, there's going to be a lot of eyes on that reporting. There'll probably be some complaints come in from some of the individuals if they get a notice. And you have to assume or be prepared that there might be a follow-up investigation, either from an agency like the FCC or SEC or FTC or Attorney General. And it's really good when this investigation comes in, it could come in the form of a letter, or it could come in the form of a more formal investigation. The FTC uses civil investigative demands, which are kind of like interrogatories. And if you've documented everything that's happened, it's going to be a lot easier to respond to that investigation and make the investigation go away. So the practice pointer at the end, document. We've mentioned that a few times, but it will really pay dividends. It probably feels like a pain. You've just gone through an incident and now to have to document everything. And perhaps you're already in your next incident, but it's important. Next slide, please. And to go along with documenting, it's really good if you don't have internal policies, procedures, and controls to go ahead and get those in place. Because as the sub-bullet here says, it's not a matter of when an incident, if an incident will occur, it's when. And it's a lot easier to deal with an incident if you already have policies and procedures and controls in place. Next slide, please. So, as I kind of alluded to, if you don't have these policies and documentation in place, you may not fare well in an investigation. So you definitely want, as a minimum, a policy for the evaluation and reporting of incidents, and then create procedures for your incident response team based on that policy. Identify those stages that I talked about. Pickerel, that gives you a framework to work from. Make sure you understand your triggers that will trigger each stage of the analysis. And make sure you have legal counsel as part of this effort. And a tabletop exercise can go a long way in testing out and vetting whatever policies and procedures you put in place. There's a lot of lessons learned when you do a tabletop exercise. And I should probably back up there because I know not everybody may understand what a tabletop exercise is. A tabletop exercise is where you either put it together in-house or you have a third party put it together for you, but it's a hypothetical for an actual incident. And they will step you through, you and your incident response team, through a hypothetical, and they'll throw issues at you that you have to resolve or address. For example, they'll say, day one, this happened. What are you going to do? Day two, more information. How are you going to handle that? All the way up through the end of the theoretical or the incident. And then you fold back into, at the end of the exercise, you'll fold back into lessons learned to make your procedures better. And the goal is to have these procedures to be really good so that when you do have an incident, which is a hair on fire event, that you know what you're going to do, you know who the people are that are going to do the work, and it's less stressful. Keep in mind that the bad guys know your work schedule, and you can count on an incident happening Friday just after everybody left on a holiday weekend. And again, here we go again with the documents. For every incident, document whether the incident was reportable or not reportable. Be able to, if you're ever investigated, be able to go to your documentation and show why you determined it was not reportable or whether it was reportable, and have that analysis. Next slide, please. It's really important to make sure your vendors have in place the same policies and procedures that you have in place, because they're an extension of your responsibility and your reporting. And the worst scenario is if your data is with a vendor and the vendor has an incident and they don't report that to you, you're still responsible for that data. And most reporting obligations require the customer to contractually obligate their vendors to receive that information so the customer can report that. And if here are 3 bullets, I just want to walk through here real quickly. Are your vendors processing information? Do you have contractual obligations with your vendors to report data incidents? Are you uncomfortable as to whether your vendors would report an incident in time for you to meet your reporting obligations? If you answer yes to any of the above questions, the 3 questions I just went through, it's a good time to get a contract in place. We call these data privacy processing agreements, or I've also seen them called data protection agreements. And basically, in these agreements, you know exactly the obligation that you've placed on your vendors to report to you, and other security controls that you want your vendors to put in place to protect you. Next slide.
And
go ahead, Michael.
just yeah, before we get to questions, I hope we have some shameless plug. We at Brownstein have a sort of a crisis response team that we put together that handles all aspects, legal, operational, and the PR side as well, because stuff happens. Everybody's in crisis mode, and it's kind of good to have guidance at that point. But at that point, let's see if there are any questions.
I just thought of one that I have a couple that people sent over to me, Mike, but I want to ask you one first. So the bad guys know your work schedule. So that means Brownstein must get called like on Friday afternoons with people with their hair on fire, as Jack said, and what I'm going to do, there was a data breach. So you guys must work long weekends.
You know, not always, because we don't always get brought in at the beginning. Sometimes we get brought in when the hair is not only on fire, but there's no hair left. So, you know, it would be better if we were brought in earlier. And I do monitor my phone. I have my email on my phone. And if someone needs assistance on a weekend, I do incident response counseling for our clients. I will make myself available.
Okay,
But
now,
I can tell, I'm sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Jack.
I can tell you that when I was in the house, though, a lot of weekends were spent with my phone. My wife would stare at me because my phone was pinging so much.
Yep, we all know that stare. So questions. One question that came in: how would the FCC see a potential breach if the customer is responsible, either partially or whole? Now, again, remember, you know, most of our audience are service providers, so they're providing their services to businesses. What if if our service provider's customer was the cause? And it's a multi-part question, so let me kind of drill down a little bit. You know, and what if the customer's running, you know, some end-of-life devices? Does it matter if the customer owns the device? What if the service provider is renting the device? These are all questions of obligations of service providers for a problem caused by the customer.
Wow, there's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah. I'll break it down. You can go ahead.
I'll take the end of life question first. That happens quite frequently where, you know, a major software company will come out and say, we're no longer going to support version X. You have to get off of version X.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, you're not going to get any patches. We know software is buggy. We know software has vulnerabilities, and that end-of-life software is going to continue to have vulnerabilities, but they're not going to be fixed. So at that point, I would imagine your CISO or your security guy would say, "Hey, let's find another solution for that." That would be the answer for that. I'll let you rephrase the other question.
Sure. So again, you know, so the customer, of course, is the problem. You have a customer that you're providing services to. There's a hole in their security. How, you know, does the FCC look to the service provider in that case, or to the customer who really caused the problem?
I'll take a shot at that. I mean, I think it depends on who has control over the data that was breached. You know, and I think that the fact that a third party might be responsible for an unauthorized disclosure, I don't think insulates the company that is responsible for storing and keeping the data safe from having to engage in this process and potentially having a reportable event. You know, you know, there may be certain other obligations on the third party or customer that caused it, but my sense is if the data is in the possession under the control of the telecom company and it's been breached in any way, then I think it's pretty much incumbent on the telecom company to go through this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that would, Mike, that sounds like it would kind of tie in a little bit to the fact that, you know, if telephone companies, you know, renting the end device, the phone that's sitting on the guy's desk, and the telephone company didn't put the software patches in, you know, to protect it. Sounds like it'd be the telephone company that's responsible.
Yeah, again, I hate to say, but it probably depends. You know, I think that, you know, that there used to be a problem with what wireless carriers a lot of times get in trouble because somehow one way or another location data has been leaked out of their customers. And other times, you know, it may, the FCC used to have a kind of a rule that if, you know, you're responsible for things on your customer's device if you make them put it on the device. Mm-hmm. You know, so again, you kind of have to look at the factors and what exactly what's going on.
Jack, you look like you were trying to say something. I was
just going to add that you can have an incident where you have both customers and vendors contributing to the incident in a bad way, right? there can be enough fault to go around. It's not always on one side of the fence.
Yep. Now, besides the reporting obligations, what other risks, does a service provider have? Lawsuits, from end users, that kind of stuff. The business that's a victim, because what are the other things that we should be fearing besides the reporting obligations?
Well, one thing that would be good to look at is the vendor's chain of vendors, because sometimes a customer can have vendors that may be 4 or 5 layers deep. So all the security controls need to contractually pass all the way down to the end of that vendor chain. And one of the best things a vendor can do to protect themselves is to have a good risk framework in place, but vet their vendors. Look at SOC 2 reports. Do they have ISO or NIST certifications? Look at their governance policies. A lot of that will be done under a non-disclosure agreement, but kick the tires. See, do they really have anything beyond what they're telling you they have security-wise or document-wise? Is there anything beyond that, or are there actual physical security controls in place?
Mm-hmm.
But there's certainly
One other question.
litigation risk.
Go ahead,
I'm sorry, I
Mike.
was gonna say,
Go ahead.
we certainly see sometimes with these massive data breaches, you see class action lawsuits being filed from all the consumers whose data has been breached, and those get very messy. Those again tend to be the larger companies with millions of customers, and there's been a huge amount of data released. Looks like Mark Ignesian wants to jump in a little bit here. Come on in, Mark. Ken.
Yeah, I'm going to try to make him this is a new software thing for me. Mark, I think I just promoted you to being a panelist, if that works. Maybe not.
There he is.
Go ahead. And now unmute yourself, Mark.
Maybe we have to unmute him.
There you go.
Okay, man. Can you hear me?
You're in, Mark.
Oh, hey guys. Hey, thanks for this session. It's really important. I would encourage all the attendees to really go back and do their homework on their security plan and how this all factors in, because as it's been described, it's really not a matter of if, it's really one of these things, a matter of when. It's just such a rampant thing going on in terms of what's taking place in security. One of the pieces here, I actually that question about if the customer causes it, my 2 cents on that question there was, if you're holding information for your customers and you have any kind of gap in your service delivery environment, whether it was some servers you left open, these are all entry points into your world, if you will. So if somehow the customer is able to use some expired piece of equipment, then ultimately that's a gap in your system. You left the door open somehow. And you might say, hey, well, shame on them for doing it. But really, if you let that thing exist, I would suggest you still would have a culpability there.
Yeah, along those lines, Mark, you see a lot of incidents where APIs are open and people get in through those, and that API is application programming interface, but basically that can be access to your data through that.
I got two things I was looking to ask real quick. One is, you're in business and there's a lot of burdens placed on business to be in business. Okay, so hey, that's the cost of entry and operations, right? But if a bad guy perpetrates your business and you've done as best you could to keep the bad guys out, a lot of this stuff here and all the actions going on, it's like the victim is the perpetrator. It's like the service provider, they got breached, but it's being treated like they're the perpetrator of it. You know what I mean? And that's why there's why the question about the lawsuits and all that and all this other reporting stuff. So I mean, what do maybe, I don't know, maybe it's more of just a philosophical question here, but it just seems like that's how you get painted, that you
Yeah.
were breached, but it's your fault and you should have known better and blah, blah, blah. And therefore we're going to go and string you up. So you're trying to run your business. You got to do all this reporting. You're trying to keep everything running back the way it needs to be running. And you're being dragged through the coals, at the same time. It's like,
Yeah. One thing I'll say about that, Mark, and I there's certainly an aspect of that, but one of the rationales for the reporting is that it's designed to provide information to the government to help them, learn about new methods that are being used by the bad guys. So there's an informational aspect to it that is designed to kind of help protect everybody. So, it's not just that, you suffered a breach and maybe you're a bad guy because you didn't do the right things, but the reporting also has this sort of informational sharing aspect to it.
Yeah, that was my last part of my question. I know we're up at time here. Was what was really the reporting thing trying to make better? Why is this making us all better because of this reporting? And I guess it's to learn more about what the behavior of the bad guys are. Is that?
I think that's an aspect of it that you see kind of throughout the FCC's order when it's talking about the reasons for this is to help, the federal law enforcement and the FCC, keep an eye on what's going on out there. And if there's a new kind of breach method or something that gets reported, then hopefully that people can learn about that and take steps to protect themselves.
Great. And yeah, we are out of time, but Jack and Mike and Mark, thank you guys. Thank you guys for putting this on today. Really fascinating, a little scary. But I kind of encourage you, if nothing else, write down Mike's name and Jack's name, because it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen, and you're going to want their names, especially on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
Keep that number in your wallet, I think.
Yeah.
Hope to see everybody at Cloud Connections, April 17th and 19th in St. Pete, Florida. If you have any questions about the event, feel free to go to www.cloudcommunications.com/CC24. Look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. Thank you guys very much. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Take care.